promise to us all, a reminder that monumental achievement comes at monumental cost. On a late spring day in 1919, the story goes, one of America's wealthiest men, his holdings valued at more than $100 billion in today's dollars, sat up in his sickbed in his Manhattan home and called to one of his caregivers for a pen and paper. Andrew Carnegie, 83, now a wizened and influenza-ravaged man, began to write as if possessed. When he was finished, he summoned his long-time personal secretary, James Bridge. "Take this to Frick," Carnegie said as he handed the letter to his old confidant. It would have been enough to snap Bridge upright. True, Henry Clay Frick was a fellow giant of industry, and he and Andrew Carnegie had been partners once. But so far as anyone knew, the two men had not exchanged a word in nearly 20 years, not since Carnegie drove Frick out of the business, and Frick successfully pressed a monumental lawsuit against his former partner, the first in a long string of vengeful acts. Bridge left Carnegie and made his way down Fifth Avenue from Carnegie's awe-inspiring 64-room mansion across from Central Park at 91st Street to an even more imposing structure some 20 blocks south. By the time Bridge arrived at the Frick mansion, he would have been beside himself, not only wondering as to the contents of the message he carried, but fearing the response of the man to whom it was addressed. Though Frick, along with Carnegie, stood at only 5 feet 3 inches and was white-bearded by now as well, he would never be mistaken for Santa Claus. Bridge knew Frick's legendary toughness well. This was one executive as willing to use his fists as well as his voice to deal with an enemy or a rival. Bridge could be forgiven his apprehension as Frick tore open the envelope and scanned its contents. Frick glanced up at Bridge accusingly. "So, Carnegie wants to meet me, does he?" Bridge could only stare back, dumbfounded. But a meeting was precisely what Carnegie had called for. In his careful script, Carnegie had reasoned that both he and Frick were growing old, and that past grievances were beneath their dignity. Surely it was time to meet and patch up the wounds they had inflicted upon each other. Time to make amends and prepare to meet their maker. The words might have touched a chord in almost any other man, but Henry Clay Frick showed no sign of gratitude or relief. "Yes, you can tell Carnegie I'll meet him," Frick said, wadding the letter and tossing it back at Bridge. "Tell him I'll see him in hell, where we both are going." Henry Frick's reaction on that New York spring day in 1919 can be traced back to the events of a fateful summer in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, some 30 years before. Independence Day of 1892 will do as a starting point. As that anniversary of the nation's founding approached, most citizens of the United States were aware that their world was changing at a rapid pace, technologically and otherwise. By anyone's lights, material progress was mind-boggling. Though not in widespread use, the device known as the telephone had come into being in 1876, and the electric light bulb had followed 3 years later. On the other hand, men were still buttoning up their trousers in 1892, for it would be another year before the zipper made its debut. It would be 3 more years before the movie projector made its first appearance, while the player piano, refrigerated air conditioning, and the radio station were still the stuff of dreams and whimsy. The country, just over a century old, comprised only 44 states, with Wyoming having joined the fold in 1890. Still to come were Utah, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona. Battles with Indians was still the stuff of major news. The Battle of Wounded Knee had taken place in 1891. The population of the Republic stood at barely 61 million. Some 5.25 million of them lived in Pennsylvania. Second in numbers only to New York's 6 million. Though Philadelphia was the largest city in the Keystone State, in the far western section lay the important industrial city of Pittsburgh. Its 250,000 residents, living in and about the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, made it the 13th largest city in the nation. There was much talk in 1892 Pittsburgh about the upcoming presidential election, in which Democrat Grover Cleveland was waging a spirited campaign against the incumbent Republican Benjamin Harrison. In Pittsburgh, a working man's town, the opinion of the citizenry was divided. Many favored the Democrat Cleveland out of general principle. Others were prepared to vote for Republican Harrison, who championed stiff tariffs that protected American-made industrial goods against foreign competition. The tariffs were the brainchildren and the darlings of the steel industry's owners. But laborers, who feared losing jobs because of cheaper foreign imports, supported them too. A grand optimism and expansionist spirit was fueled not only by the advancements in technology that had marked the years since the Civil War, but also by the tremendous growth in industry that supported and grew out of scientific development. The discovery of oil in northwestern Pennsylvania in 1859 touched off one such momentous development, though that industry's initial contribution to American society came in the form of kerosene, an inexpensive fuel for lamps. Suddenly, nighttime illumination was no longer the indulgence of the very few who could afford the cost of whale oil. With John D. Rockefeller and Henry Flagler at the forefront of the Standard Oil Combine, production of oil in the United States would grow from 2,000 barrels in 1859 to more than 64 million barrels at the end of the century. Another major development was the vast expansion of the nation's rail system. As the Civil War began, there were fewer than 30,000 miles of track in all the United States, and much of that was of varying gauges and states of repair. Owing to the enterprise of such men as Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had earlier developed the nation's steamship freight and travel network, J. Edgar Thompson, longtime head of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and J.P. Morgan, who threw much of the weight of his family's banking enterprise into rail investment, the 1890s saw the width of railroad track standardized and nearly 163,000 miles of roadway put into use. To build this vast network of tracks and bridges, no supporting industry was more important than iron and steel. Most of those early 30,000 miles of railway had been made of iron, an industry accounting for 835,000 tons of product by 1860. The technological advancements that allowed for the mass production of steel and the vast expansion of the rail system proceeded hand in hand to the end of the 19th century, when the United States was turning out 10 million tons of steel, more than Great Britain, France, and Germany combined. In less than half a century, the United States had been transformed from a largely agrarian and underdeveloped federation of competing interests to a relatively cohesive economic juggernaut, promoting a jackpot mentality in anyone willing to work hard and take the occasional chance. Perhaps no single individual was more influential in spreading the gospel of upward mobility than Horatio Alger, Jr., whose series of novels featuring the exploits of penniless but morally upright urchins, reaping fortune's rewards through decency, hard work, and courage, would sell more than 20 million copies. At the other end of the fictional spectrum lay the work of Mark Twain, whose 1873 novel, The Gilded Age, satirized the unbridled greed and political shenanigans indulged in by the politicians and get-rich-quick schemers of the day. The novel's title would in time come to evoke almost the opposite of what Twain had intended. The phrase Gilded Age is now understood as the largely grand and stirring period in American history, stretching from the post-Civil War years through the turn of the century, a time during which the United States would undergo a revolution as significant as the grand political experiment that forged it in the first place. During this period, with its political foundations firmly established, the United States would set the stage to become not only moral exemplar to the world, but also its leading economic power. The age of the Founding Fathers was over. The age of the Titans had begun. There had been an iron industry in the New World from the earliest days, with a blast furnace established near what is now Saugus, Michigan, in 1645. The smelting of iron and the production of iron implements, such as stove castings, pots and pans, nails, ship plating, and farming tools, had continued in the colonies and states ever since, but it remained a cottage industry throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 1830s, however, things began to change. Anthracite coal, a substance so dense it is classified as rock by geologists, began to supplant charcoal as a source of fuel, and vast